talk, but yeah. All right, so what we're doing today is, what we're doing over the course of the series is I wanted to talk for a little bit about complex relationships that you have with people, right? As we talked about villains for a little bit, and you watch these, and obviously villains in movies are these like outlandish, big, real big bad guys. But at the end of the day, you've also probably experienced people who were mean to you at the office place, and in the moment, they actually feel villainous in some ways, right? Anybody had somebody gossip about you and you found out about it later? Be honest, we're just gonna do a poll. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah, or you've been at the office and somebody like constantly one-upped you and like put you down. Has anybody ever experienced this before? Yeah, and then I get this, I remember this. Somebody told me one time, the meanest people on the planet are 8th grade girls. Is this true? Yeah, you remember this? Now, I have a daughter, so I'm pre-preparing myself for this, you know what I mean? But somebody told me one time, it was like, girls can smile at each other and then just look at each other and say all they, so I'm going to, like, you ever had a girl, and they looked at it and it was like, smiling, like, you ever one of these? I'm like, that was a terrible impression, but you got it. There's a little bit of this, like, I don't even understand how that works, but you can feel the meanness at times from some of these people, and I think it's so fascinating. Most of us have experienced this. Some of you experienced with a family member. Like, you had somebody in your family who's like that uncle, and every time you're around them, they're just a little bit, you know what I mean? And what happens a lot of times is what happens for us is that just grows in us, right? And if you're really honest, right, no matter how good of a human you are, no matter how good of a person or how kind you are, there's something in us that when it comes to people who are not good to us, it's hard for us to be good back to them, right? I put in my notes to say it this way. Goodness doesn't easily flow specifically from me to people who aren't good. Have you ever experienced this? Like, it's hard for me to be good to the person who puts me down. It's hard for me to do that. It's hard for me to not be mean back to somebody who's mean to me. I put in my notes to say it this way. That kindness doesn't easily flow to people who are unkind to me, right? Now, it's not that I can't do it. It's just that it doesn't come naturally. When someone's unkind to me, I feel it. Or specifically, especially those of you who are parents in the room, if somebody's unkind to your kids, you know what I mean? Like, there's a whole new level of that you have. You know what I mean? There's a whole new version of, like, you can say things about me, and I can, but like, like my kids, I'm like, I'm not a pastor. You know what I mean? Like, it's about that. And there's parts of these things when you look at this and you go, the kindness thing, it doesn't flow naturally, right? You put this online too. If you put this on social media, when someone's unkind on social media, it's even easier to be unkind back, right? There's all these moments. The hard one for me too is sensitivity, right? Sensitivity doesn't flow easily or naturally from me to people who are also insensitive. Like, it's hard for me to feel something for somebody else in those moments where they're being insensitive either to me or people that I love or care about. And then the harder one too for me is compassion, right? Compassion doesn't easily flow from me to people who are not compassionate to me, right? Here's what's funny about me too. I don't know if you like this. If I mess up, I want grace from other people. And if they're not compassionate or graceful to me when I mess up, it is hard for me when they then mess up to also show compassion or kindness back. There's this thing in us that has this sort of kind of, I don't know how to say this well, but almost like one-upping or making it equal or making it right, where we reciprocate with the kind of force that we've sort of been given. And then you look in Scripture, or you look in some of these principles that we find, and you've seen this before, which is one of the hardest things. And you've seen this, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, which is a great thing that you tell your kids at some point along the way. And then at the end of the day, you might do this, but everything in you resists it when something is happening to you or something is happening to somebody that you love, right? And the reason that this is true and the reason this thing kind of boils up in us or that comes out in us is that it feels unjust to be kind to people who are unkind, right? It feels unjust to get back at people who aren't good to us. It feels unjust to do those things. And then in a lot of places what we find is this kind of push towards saying, well, just do what you would hope somebody would do to you if you were mean. And if I were really honest, come on, you know this, if I'm mean to somebody, I kind of expect them to be mean back. You know what I mean? I'm a little bit looking for a fight in those moments. There's something in us that specifically with anger or being mean to other people, this grows and then we respond oftentimes in kind. Now, we can talk about this anger cycle. I don't need to tell you this. You already know this, but just so that we're all clear, what happens typically for us is there's a triggering event that causes this. Now, what's fascinating to me about the triggering event is this can either be from the person that you're angry at, or it could be something else altogether, right? It can be somebody else altogether that triggers you, and then all of a sudden you put this out in a different direction. That triggers then the negative thought, whatever that thing is that pops in your head that's negative and kind of grows in you. And then for most of us, there's some version of an emotional response that comes next. And then, I love this, I don't know if this is true of you, then there's a physical symptom that happens to most of us. Like physiologically, you see this happen. I have friends, and I love this. You can tell when they're mad, whether they're showing it or not, by their face. You ever seen this? I have friends that like their face gets red even if they're smiling. You ever seen this? Like they can say all the right things, and at the same time, it's like you look like you're going to explode. There's a little bit of these sorts of things. You have a physical response to this. Some of you know what it's like for your heart to feel like it's about to beat out of your chest as you try to do the right thing to somebody else. Physically, your body is telling you that you are angry and have the capacity to do some sort of damage next. And then what comes after this is like this behavioral sort of reaction. And for most of us, it's a reaction. It's something that grows. Now, what's hard about this, and this is what makes the anger thing, but specifically beyond anger, the actions of being mean to other people. What makes this so difficult is this triggering event that I talked about often isn't towards the people that we are mean to. And the people who are mean to us, it's often not even something that we did. Have you ever been mad at somebody else and taken it out on your spouse? You know? Have you ever been mad at somebody else or taking it out on your boss? Have you ever had a bad boss in the past and you brought all of that into your new boss in the present, right? Have you ever had these moments where you love your kids so much and you have a threshold for they're crazy, and then all of a sudden that threshold gets a whole lot less because of what you're bringing home in those moments? You have triggering events all the time that aren't connected to the places that your anger and oftentimes meanness comes out in, and that's true of other people. And so I put in my notes and said this way: what naturally happens in me, and I think what happens in most of us, is that we naturally reciprocate anger with more anger. This is kind of one of those things. I grew up in environments where we call this like generational curses, which is always fun. It's a big way of talking about how sometimes people who are mean or have parents that are mean then become mean themselves and they don't know why. You ever seen this before? You ever talked to somebody and you've seen something come out of them and you go, you didn't just pick that up. You acquired that along the way. Me and Joe coached this year, which I'll bring up about 90 more times over the next few weeks. And what's fun about this is you'll see this a lot. Sometimes you look at dads who get like really aggressive towards kids, and you feel it, and you see this. Like on the field, I'll see this every once in a while, and you go, what is that? And oftentimes it is like a version of something that they were handed or given along the way. Or expectation. You've seen it. Many of you have felt this from your parents. And you know your parents' story. The older that you got as a parent and the more that you learn from your family, you go, that's where that came from, because you recognize that it's almost like it gets passed on because we reciprocate anger with more anger. And when people give you this, when people respond to you that way, there's something in you, even if you're the kindest person, who at least feels all of the things around this. Now, what's hard about this, and this is where we're going to kind of spend the bulk of our time, that's this, that every time I allow my emotions to be guided by someone else's anger, what I typically am doing is handing over some version of power to that person. Here's what I mean by that. When someone is mean to me, and I take that on, and I carry that, and then somewhere else it comes out in my leadership or my family or people that I love, or it comes out in another place, I have handed those people power over future moments of my life. And this is where when you look at it, you go like, it is one of the hardest cycles to break. It's one of the most difficult cycles to break. And most all of us have people in our lives who exude some level of unkind or meanness to us. Many of you have had Thanksgiving or Christmases, you know this, that have been ruined by 2 comments made by somebody that you don't even care about that much. And the people that you actually care about received your wrath that you didn't give to them at the table. You know what I mean? And you look at these, and they're robbing future moments with people that we love and care about because of the ways that we've kind of accepted it or received those moments. Now, I grew up in places too, and again, this is what's so fascinating, where when we talk about like the Christian response to this, the ways that I was brought up as a kid was very much one where we'd say like the Christian response to this is some version of passivity, right? that Christians would be passive about this. Now, you wouldn't say it exactly like this, but in some form or fashion, you were kind of hugging the person that was mean back to you, and that never made sense to me, especially with my wiring, right? That in some form or fashion, you let it go, or you were passive about it, or you were inactive, or you just received it. And some of you know people who have done this. Some of you have watched people in your family, and you would never say this to them, but it felt like they were a doormat to someone else's unkind or mean advances towards them. And some version of what you were taught was that we were supposed to be passive. Now, if you're not a follower of Jesus in the room, I'll tell you this. What I'm going to say for the next couple of minutes is something that you kind of get off the hook on. And I'm kind of jealous that you do. I'll just be really honest. Because it's actually so much worse or better, depending on how you look at this, than passivity. Passivity is not what the New Testament teaches around this. It's so much bigger than this. In fact, for people who are followers of Jesus, we don't even get the option of being a follower of Jesus and not being active in this in some way. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at a passage. It's one that you may have been familiar with before. It's in an area of the Bible called Luke. Luke's one of my favorite places to read, mostly because Luke was a doctor. He's a physician. And what he did throughout this whole book of the Bible, he went and interviewed people who had experienced these stories in the ancient world, experienced Jesus, experienced what was going on in the early church, all of these sorts of things. He compiled all of these eyewitness accounts and he put them down. And one of the things that we look at is one of Jesus's kind of bigger teachings on all these different areas of life. And one of these places, he actually talks about a response by this group of people who had experienced mean people a lot, and mean people in terms of an entire sort of system of people being unkind and coming against them. And Jesus teaches about this. Now, what's also fascinating is when Jesus teaches out on the stuff that he teaches out on in this sort of series of messages and parables, all these sorts of things, this is actually where his popularity and some of his followers begin to decrease, because it's not the fun things to tweet that he says. In fact, it's very, very hard, some of the stuff that he teaches out in this. And so what Jesus says to a group of people who had experienced this backlash consistently, he says this. He goes, look, when it comes to your enemies, he says, love your enemies. Now, you can look at it, if somebody says love something, like I love hot dogs and I love my kids. Like, you know what I mean? Like, love is one of those things that you could look at so many different ways. And what Jesus does, he takes his love your enemies, and then he says this. He says, do good to those who hate you. And this is what's so interesting to me about Jesus' teaching on this, is when Jesus says, love your enemies, you can interpret that a lot of different ways. You can look at that a lot of different ways. You could embrace that in so many different ways. I love you, and at the same time, I kicked you. You know, like there's both of those things that are happening. I love you, but I still figured out a way to cut you down. But what Jesus does is he connects action to our full response to the people who come against us. He says, love your enemies. He says, do good to those who hate you. And then he does this, and this is probably the harder part. He goes this. He goes, bless those who curse you. Which I try to think of a lot of ways to talk about this, because blessing isn't a thing that we talk about a ton. When he talks about blessing those who curse you, there's a piece of this that's deeply connected to figure out a way to hope for and want what's best for someone else, or the best interests of somebody else, even as they come against you. And then he says this, which is all wrapped up in interesting stuff. He says, then pray for those who mistreat you. Now, if you're a person who prays consistently more than like dinner time and to help you with tests, that sort of thing, the praying thing is fascinating, because if you've ever tried to pray for somebody who's hurt you recently after they've hurt you, it is one of the most painful things to do, right? Have you ever prayed for somebody who like hurt your kids? Like just like, not like in a physical way, but like prayed for somebody who's like, who embarrassed them or did something like that. That is a hard prayer to pray with any sort of intent that's real. And when Jesus begins to teach out on this, he's going, look, you're not just like saying, hey, I love you. Like, it's so much worse than that. You're to do something good for the people who have hurt you. Now, let me give the caveat, because if you're in the room and some of you have experienced versions of this that are extreme. So I'll also go like, there are extreme versions of this that are not applicable in the same way, right? So let's just be honest about that. When we're talking about abuse, this is not that. When we're talking about some of these outlandish sort of things, this is not that. There absolutely should be boundaries around this. But a lot of what we experience when it comes to the meanness and unkindness of people This is exactly what he's talking about. This is exactly the response that Jesus calls his closest followers to in a way that is resisting the cycle that perpetuates itself over and over again. Then a few verses later, it says it like this. It says, but love your enemies. And then he goes on and he says, and from there, do good to them and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High. Meaning that there's something in you that continues to transform as you act in this resistance towards what is. And then he goes on and he says this. So if you want to know why this is, it's because he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Now, again, if you're not a follower of Jesus, this is one of those parts that is both hard to like fully wrap your head around and also hard to accept about God. Because the pieces of me that love God often love the ways that I choose to look at God or view God, which is also very aligned with how I think God should be, which is fully just in these sorts of ways. That an eye for an eye kind of thing. That if you do this, then you should get this. But what's hard about this, and what's hard about the New Testament writers, and what's hard about the early church, and what's hard about the experience of what goes on here, and what's hard about Jesus, is Christianity hinges on somebody who gave their life for people who were mistreating him. The earliest followers of Jesus, the disciples of Jesus, it hangs on this message of hope and truth going throughout the world with people who gave their lives on behalf of the people who were doing these things to them. And not in a passive way. Passivity would say, I ignore it. Passivity steps back and says, you know what, I'm just not going to engage with it. That's not at all the Christian response. The Christian response is engaging fully in the opposite direction of what's coming towards you. And then he goes on, and probably the more gut-wrenching part of what he says is this. He says, because he is kind to the ungrateful and wicked, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Meaning that for those of us who are followers of Jesus, the extent of the grace that you've been given and the love that you've been given and the kindness that you've been given, to what degree do I go? That's the degree that he calls us to. Now, this is really honest, maybe you never heard a pastor guy say this before. This is one of the sections of the Bible that if I were editing the Bible, I would just take out. Can I just be really honest? This is one of those, I'd love for this not to be there. It would be great if this didn't exist. Like, you got most of it right. Thanks so much, Jesus. There's one section, can we talk about it, And here's why. Here's the honest part of it is when I get on Twitter and I watch Twitter arguments, it's kind of fun. I enjoy it. I'm just like, yes, you got him. You know what I mean? Like, anybody watch the Cleveland Indians games last night? If you didn't, go back and watch the replay. I was all about that. Bam! You know what I mean? I was like, let's go. Like, it was fascinating. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you're going to enjoy lunch. It was great. Like, there's a piece of me that goes, come on, we're going to reciprocate. As soon as they squared up last night, I was like, go Braves. And then I was like, like there's a piece of me that's like, of course, Like I was watching the game yesterday, and this is the Braves game. This is so funny. It's the smallest little things. One of the Braves players steals a base, immediately gets up, and one of the Braves players that got traded was the shortstop. He gets up and like punches him, like as a joke. The immediate response back from the shortstop is to punch him harder. I just thought it was so funny. And they're being playful. But even in the most playful moments, we look for the just and the balance to be set for us in terms of those things. And what's so hard for people who are followers of Jesus is that Jesus isn't giving you the option not to swing back. It's not like that sort of thing. And it's not passivity and saying you're ignoring it. It's going in the direction that is opposite of that sort of meanness, unkindness sort of thing. And this is hard. And the reason that it's hard, and don't miss this, is because the natural response for most all of us is to right the wrong with more wrong and to become like the people that we don't like. And the reason that we like that is because it feels good. And it feels good because it feels like we're here. But here's what you also know. That we're never here, right? Like you never get even. You might get ahead, and then they try to get ahead. Like there's this, but there's never even. And the reason is that when you are hurt, or someone causes you pain, or someone does something to you that's unjust, or somebody does something to you that was wrong and unfair, please don't miss this. Getting back at them never actually brings back what they took from you. You know, like some of you grew up in families where a parent was absent for a season or most of it or whatever, and as mad as you are at them, as angry as you are, as much as you come back with all of the, like all that stuff, as much as you do, you never get back 11 years old. You don't get it. It's never even. It's never right. As much as you come back at your spouse, when they come at you, and you're never unrobbed of what they said that hurt. You're not. For the boss that's, this, that's just overbearing and unkind, and takes from you a night from your family and doesn't care what you've contributed or certainly doesn't appreciate it, all those kinds of things. You getting back at them with the slight, behind their back stuff, it always feels in the moment because it feels like you're leveling up, but you never level up because you never get back what they took. And what Christianity does, what Jesus does when he teaches out on this, is he simply acknowledges that you don't get it back, and if you're not going to get it back, end it. End the cycle of continuing to perpetuate what's going on. Put a period at the end of it rather than ellipses. Now, where this is hard, come on, this is what's hard. I think there's so many things about this, but one of the things that's hard is when you don't, whatever you come back with or whatever posture that is, it's like a chain that grips you and it doesn't ever quite let you go. You've met people who are bitter in their 50s or 60s or 70s, and they're bitter not because of everything that's happened for 35 or 40 years, but because of something that happened that triggered a cycle of thinking, a cycle of being in the world. They gripped their heart and took everything else over this. And there's something about that you go like, what is that? You meet 20-year-olds who do the same thing. These mind patterns, these thought patterns that bring you into it, and until it's broken, you will carry that with you. And you don't break it by leveling up because you can never, ever level up. You just get more mean. You just get more unkind. And you see this in marriages too. Like marriages. You see this all the time. I'm always fascinated by this. This is always fascinating to me. But if you watch couples sometimes, you ever been around a couple who will tear each other down like in little ways? You know what I mean? And you go, it's a one up kind of thing. You ever seen that? And I'll just tell you, we watch this. These things of slight one-upping, they build and they create distance because it never ends until kindness is inserted, until goodness is inserted. It does not end, and it is a discipline, and it is painful, and it is what makes Christianity a little bit unattractive, I think. Because Jesus does not look at you and go, feel good, feel better. He goes, end it. End that cycle for yourself and for other people. So here's the bottom line, and we'll wrap up here in just a minute, but this is the bottom line. Doing good, right? Doing good to those who have not been good to us. It actually is freeing. And if I can convince you of this outside of the moments that you're in, it's freeing for us both presently, and it's also freeing to us in our future, right? Both presently and in our future. All right, so I'm going to tell you a really easy example of this. Ready? This is one of my favorite examples of this. Some of you know this about our story. We were in Michigan, and we did a church merger up in Traverse City. And at the time when they hired me, I was 27 years old when I went up there. And there's a couple things about the church that we did is I was 27. The person who was there before me was a lot older than me, had started the church. It was an amazing church. And then they left, and they went to go do missions work. But there were a lot of people that attended the church that were very frustrated or angry about what was going on. And so there was a night that, if you can imagine this, it was a business meeting for the church. And if anybody ever been to a church business meeting? Sorry, anybody grew up Southern Baptist like I did? These were always fun. Like, we did these business meetings at our church, and it was kind of like the Indians game. It felt like that a little bit. You know what I mean? Like, there was some anger and sort of thing. And so there were two guys on stage. There was the pastor of that church and the other pastor who was kind of like the senior pastor of all of our churches. They were sitting together. And they were people, and we just gave out a microphone. And we said, hey, tell us what you think. We want to answer questions. And we did that. They all sat together. There was about 70-ish of these people that sat in one part of the church to do this. And the guy who had the microphone that was passing it around was like our executive pastor. And he was like generally the kindest, he was my boss, amazing, amazing guy. He is a military vet, like super wise, like very on top of it, really, really great guy. And I watched, and over the course of about 2.5 hours, we were sitting on the front row, if you can imagine this, it just escalated. It just kept escalating. It didn't get less, it just got more. And they had a mic, and he would walk around and hand the mic to these people, which was fascinating. They'd come out and just like, oh, and then it was like, but I'm gonna one-up that, and just throwing down. And then they started to get mad at the guy who had the microphone, not knowing that he actually was the most powerful person in that room. He was the one who actually carried more power than the two guys on stage. He was the guy who brought this together. He was the guy who had sacrificed hours and hours and hours, and as he would joke now, years off of his life, doing these sorts of things to bring this together. And I'll never forget, he's doing this, and the people who were angry had no idea who he was. And towards the end of the night, one of the guys gets up, so angry and amped. And my friend, my boss, goes up, and he has the microphone, and he holds it up to him, and the guy starts yelling at him, and then starts like saying phrases that were kind of emasculating to him, because he was sort of just going off on it. And I'll never forget, everything in me at 27 had this thing that was rising up in me, and I sat there disappointed that my boss didn't match his posture and tone. Like, I was like, end it by matching it. End it by throwing down. I've seen you with your cut downs. They're joking with me. I know how smart you are. I know you're smart. I know you could end this. End it. And yet he called him sir. He was very kind. He went back. He answers questions. Super kind, so gracious. And then at the end of it, I'll never forget this, the guy was also a military guy. And he goes, you don't even know what it's like. And then pulled that card in particular, not knowing that my boss was so high up at one point in the military. And I watched, and I'm like, pull the card, draw 4, you know what I mean? Like, let's go, come on. And he never did. And he listened. And then he came back to me and told me what the guy said. And he's like, that's a good thought. I'm like, shut up, you know what I mean? Like, no, it's not, you know? I'm like, and he was kind, and here's what happened, really. He let him go until his air ran out, until he had nothing else to say. And then afterwards, he's just there, still holding the mic. And he goes, is there anything else? And I went, and I was upset. I was like, why wouldn't you just? And I talked to him afterwards, and I'll never forget it. He said this. He goes, especially leaders, you always have the choice to assume that you can put a period on it by matching it. But it never quite does. It never quite does. He's like, or you can choose kindness, and you'll just watch. And it just kind of, now here's what's hard. Is I don't ever feel that when it matters. I don't ever feel it. I might do it, but I never feel it. And what Jesus is teaching out throughout all of this is going like, you're likely not going to feel it. So do something. Go beyond. Do something that matters in those moments. Feel like, how do you deal with mean people, right? You deal with them by going the opposite direction, by moving in what I think is like, we put this next slide up, this beautiful resistance, right? This uncommon, uncharacteristic of all of social media, resistance to the cycle of this. Now, let me say, it's easier for me to say this on a stage and in a church, and of course that's what the pastor says, and of course that's what Christianity. And I may or may not know what your pain is, and you're right. I may or may not. I probably don't. And I may not know what they said to you or what they did. You're right. And there are certainly categories where they've removed the option for you to do something good, and I get that too. But I'll tell you this. When you can, and when you can or you have the opportunity or you have the capacity to move forward with actionable kindness in the face of that kind of meanness, I'm just going to tell you something. That is the closest thing to a period you're ever going to get on those sentences. It is. It's the closest thing that you're ever going to get. It's the closest thing that you're going to get towards removing that cycle. Now, does that mean you never get angry? No. Like you read through the New Testament, there's anger all over the place. It's not that it doesn't exist. But if you want to know how it ends, if you want to know what puts the period at the end, it is an actionable kindness in their direction. And some of you have seen this. Some of us don't see it enough to make us want to do it often. But you've seen somebody who carried the fullness of whatever posture this is towards us. And some of you have seen those people break in the midst of kindness. And you know, the hardest person that you're trying to lead breaks at your kindness. The spouse who, over years and years and years of hardness, they don't break at you matching it. They break the version of your kindness. We were on vacation the last couple of weeks. Emily looked at me at one point. I was being stupid. And I was all amped up, and it was coming towards her. And I'll never forget. She just looked at me. She goes, "Is this towards me? Or are you mad at, where are you mad at?" And then she put a straw in my drink. I was like, don't do that. You know, like, look, anything but that kind of kindness. No, not that. How you be mad at somebody who put the straw in your drink? I'm like, and she gave me my nuggets with a ketchup. I'm like, I love you so much, but I'm angry. You know, like, yeah. And you know that you've seen because you've seen it in small ways. It's hard to believe in big ways, but it's also true in both. It is true that your level of kindness, your beautiful resistance to that is what puts the period on the cycle. And I don't miss this. And make sure that you don't pass it on to the other places and other people in your life. And so here's the commitment. This is what I wish I could get everybody to commit to as a follower of Jesus, and that's this. That I commit to actively push against that cycle. And the New Testament has language around it. And they give these descriptors of what this looks like. You ready? It's fun. It's love and joy and peace and patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. None of those come naturally to me. 0 of them, you know. But what's funny about this list is when you look at the list, right, you look at this. All of these actually funnel those 3 right there. Now, don't miss this. The love, the action of love, the patience, the choice to be patient, the kindness, the goodness, the gentleness, the self-control, they all are like funding your joy. And they fund your peace. And they end up funding your faithfulness. The people who experience the love and peace and faithfulness are people who bring about a discipline towards love and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness and self-control. All unnatural pursuits, all of it going, it is a resistance towards what is. And all of it funneling those 3 things. Which means when you meet somebody who doesn't have this capacity, doesn't feel like they have the capacity for joy, and not happiness, but joy, I always go, well, where are we at on the others, you know? Or someone who lacks peace, and this is me a lot of times, where I just feel antsy, or just feel like, what is it? I'm also looking at my relationships going, well, how am I doing in the other areas? Or faithfulness, come on, you know this. My ability to be faithful to what Jesus has called me to do is often fueled by the way I love and treat other people. And when there's a gap there, it is hard for me to find faithfulness in the midst of it. And so again, I'll say it one more time. Doing good for those who have not been good to us is freeing. It's both present and future-based. And if I can convince everybody in this room for a week to do this, I really think your life will be better. So here's what I'm going to challenge you to do. All right, this one's going to be a little bit different than the way that we typically wrap up our services, and I know it is. So we'll just kind of bear with me just for a second. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do if you would. I'd love for you just for a second. I want you to close your eyes just for a second and bow your head. I see that hand. I'm just kidding. All right, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think of the 1 or 2 or 3 names that are mean to you. Now, you could come up with a better word for it, like whatever it is. Who are the the people that come to mind as we talk today? Who are those people? Right? Now, you got them. Maybe you got the one or two. For some of you, it's like a very clear name. You get it? Some of you wouldn't say it out loud. Some of you are sitting next to them. You get that too. It's made it real weird for you, but yeah, you got that. You got that. Now, I know this is odd, and you're like, it sounds so stupid. I want you to think of one thing. What is one thing, not 12, one thing you could do just this week for that person that they don't deserve? What's the one thing? Now, you just in your head said, there's nothing. I'm not going to do it. Okay, now we did that. Now, okay, we'll pass that. Now actually think of the one thing. What's the one thing that you could do for them? And here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Do that one thing this week. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for this truth. As unsettling as it is, as hard as it is, as painful it is, especially for people who are white like me. Father, we just ask that you would help us to be marked by this. That when there feels like there's an ellipses to all of these things in our lives, and we all bring these in here, God, that the period would happen with us, that it would stop with us. That we would be the people who are never passive, but that we engage in this beautiful resistance of what is. God, I pray for the person in the room who generally, like honestly goes, there is nothing that I can do because of what happened. And that may be true. There are things that happen like that, where people have removed themselves from a relationship or caused some kind of pain where there should be boundaries. God, I pray that you would bring at least the kind of healing at some point in time that allows them to feel the freedom in their heart, however that looks. God, that you would do that. And that even if the kind thing is a thought or a way of thinking, God, that you would help them to experience grace, if even only in their own mind in those moments. And then for all of us in the room, who are like me, and there are names that pop up, and I'm the kind of person who's ready to reciprocate or get even. God, I pray that you would break that in us, and you would help us to do the one thing, at least for 1 week, that would help those relationships, and that you would provide healing, not through just what we think, and not even through just what we pray, but through our actions of goodness in those places. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.